So hello, everyone, and welcome to Finding Your First or Next CL Job, a 2024 virtual Q&A presented by the Academy for Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry and the American Psychiatric Association. This webinar is being recorded, and we post it online for later viewing, so no need to take notes or anything. We got you. So just an overview of the webinar today. We're going to be spending about 15 minutes just talking about why CL Psychiatry, a very brief overview of the application process, and some networking opportunities at the annual CLP meeting in 24 in Miami this year, November 6th through 9th. We're then going to introduce our amazing Finding CL Job panel. And the vast majority of the time, we're going to be doing a Q&A with y'all as the attendees. Both a combination of the pre-sent questions y'all sent during registration and live questions from y'all. If you have a question, just put it into the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll just be answering them as they come in. So generally, why go into CL Psychiatry? There's so many facets. There's so many ways you can CL. There's the inpatient consults that a lot of us are accustomed to from training, but there's also med psych units, emergency psychiatry, outpatient clinics. The vast majority of CL jobs are actually a combination of inpatient and outpatient. There's multiple other models to the traditional consult models, but also proactive consults, integrated and embedded models of care, collaborative care, e-consults, and you can sub-specialize in any facet of medicine, from addictions, cardiac, to HIV/AIDS psychiatry, palliative care, transplant, women's mental health. The list just goes on and on. So another really important reason why to choose CL Psychiatry, because of DEI. Patients with psychiatric substance disorders are underserved in the general medical system, and minoritized population are underserved in our mental health system. So CL Psychiatry can really serve an important role in creating equity for our patients, because we're an embedded role within the larger healthcare system, because we often serve as an entry point for vulnerable patients into mental health treatment. And there's a lot of opportunities for advocacy and education for physician peers, healthcare staff. So if you're interested in equity and advocacy and social justice, like really consider CL Psychiatry. So, but that's easier said than done, because there's a lot of differences between like what we know from applying for residency and fellowship to applying for jobs, including in CL. In residency fellowship, you have a program list. In finding a job, there's no clear list of positions. There's a set timeline for residency and fellowship, whereas a rolling timeline for jobs. There's a centralized process, ERES and RMP, for trainees, but there's no centralized process at all for CL jobs. It's part of why we're doing this in the first place. On the plus side, when you're in training, you pay for interviews. CL jobs, they normally just pay for the interviews themselves. Training, there's clear job duties, expectations, set salary and benefits. In job hunting, there's no preset job duties, expectations. There's varied money and benefits, and all of this is negotiable too. You have the match when you're looking for a training position versus there's no match. You just get hired or don't hired, which can be the first time for a lot of us we've even been in that position. And lastly, for residency and fellowship, there's a clear start and end date versus there's no clear start end date for CL jobs, which is both scary, but also an opportunity. So things to start looking for. Again, we're going to have a lot of Q&A talk about this more in detail, but just a brief list of things you want to be thinking about looking at for a CL job. The geographic location. Is this an academic versus a community private gig? How much is in person versus work from home? What's the reputation of the job? It's up to residency fellowship, but also department, hospital, and medical center. What's the number of other CL faculty? Do you want to be the one person who does what you do? Do you want to be around a lot of other people who do that? What's the consult volume, workflow, team composition? Are there RVU requirements for this job? Are you just salaried? What are clinical opportunities both on the inpatient and outpatient side? What are the benefits like salary, health insurance, vacation? Do they give you time for conferences? Do they contribute to retirement? Is it eligible for PSLF? On the academic side, do you get protected time? Do you get reimbursed for educational costs? Are there opportunities for research and teaching? What is the culture around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is it something they just say that they do, or do they actually walk the walk? Specifically for IMG attendees, like issues around visa sponsorship, is there a Conrad waiver or not? We have to keep that in mind. And lastly, but not least, like moonlighting and the ability to work on side jobs while you're at this position. So where do you even find these CL jobs? So again, we'll talk about this more in detail in the Q&A, but first, like look at your home institution, especially if you work at a place that offers CL. You can also look at organizational listings, like ACLP has this great job flash, which if you sign up for their list, will actually send you jobs like every week or so. APA has a similar Job Central, and then also state psychiatric societies often have their own listservs that talk about jobs within their state that are available. Institutional websites often have a hiring section that say, hey, we're looking for jobs in these sectors. Conference exhibit halls, including at like ACLP and APA. Word of mouth connections is really, really key in this situation, though, because many jobs are not listed. Like personally, my first job wasn't even listed, but I was able to find it through word of mouth. Once you find a job, then you have to think, hey, how are you going to contact programs? So if there's not a job listed there, but you want to work there, what do? So I just have here just an example from myself. So when I was a fellow at UW, like looking for a job, I wanted to go back to Chicago. So I heard at University of Illinois Chicago, maybe they might be hiring, like word on the street. So I just emailed somebody I knew there from when I was a resident in the Chicago area. Dear Dr. Cooper, Happy New Year. This happened around here. Hope this finds you at UIC. I wanted to reach out. I heard from a friend that UIC may be hiring CL faculty. I'm in CL fellowship now at University of Washington, but would love to move back to Chicago area when done. I would love your advice on how to apply for this. It's still open and whom to contact. Sincerely, Chandan Kandai, CL Fellow at University of Washington. That's me. He wrote back, hi Chandan, thanks for writing and hope you're doing well. We would love to talk to you more about possibilities. If you email your CV to Luan Fan, MD, our Vice Chair for Clinical Affairs, he can start the discussions. And sent me the email. So again, I just emailed somebody new at the program, they connected me with the person. And then on the next slide, this is what's called a cover email. So very brief, like, hey, dear Dr. Fan, hope this finds you well. This is who I am, where I'm currently at, and this is what I'm looking for. And then I name drop Dr. Cooper, hey, to just email you about applying to UIC. Then in the middle paragraph, I would just talk about, hey, this is like my raison d'etre. I have a strong interest in CL psychiatry, as emerging medicine and collaborative care, trying to drop like the areas that maybe they could slot me into in their department. I'm also passionate about education, teaching residents and medical students, educational research outreach within CL to our colleague specialties. On a personal level, I'm originally from the Chicago area. I would love to move back home to be closer to my parents as they get older. So again, just sliding in the personal connection to the area. Please find attached a copy of my CV for convenience. So I worked on my CV ahead of time and attached it. I'd love to talk further, either by phone or in person if needed. Kind of wink, wink, hey, maybe call me to come back to Chicago. Would love an invite. Thanks for consideration. Have a nice weekend. And then he emailed me back and we just kind of went from there. So the interview process itself, again, just to shed some light on this, especially in this post-COVID era, it could be both virtual versus in person. You may have to think about, like, are you going to take days off? Or are these vacation days? Are these interview or academic days, especially if you're still in training? Oftentimes you can go multiple rounds, especially if it's virtual. So like my second current job where I'm at, UD Southwestern, I had like multiple days. I'd be like an hour or two, I'd be speaking with different people because that's when their schedule allowed them to speak with me. Some general tips, which you all know by now, but just as a reminder, ensure a quiet place with good Wi-Fi and lighting for virtual interviews. Create a list of questions you want to ask during the interview because you'd much rather have it in front of you and then remember an hour after the interview ended. Have PDFs of your CV publication available if needed to send to interviewers because you don't know if they got a copy of this ahead of time or not, but you can always just send it to them. And then always thank the organization post-interview, especially like program coordinators, like staff, like assistants, people doing all like the thankful work that really makes medicine happen. So if you get a job, congratulations. Now you have to start thinking about what is the start date of the job versus the finish date of your training or your last job that you're at. You'll need to think about permanent licenses you will need. Do you need to get a DA license if you don't already have it? And wise, certain states like Texas, California, New York take a really long time to get a state license. So you want to think about that when you're applying and getting a job in these places. If you're relocating, you want to think about housing. Are you going to be buying versus renting? What are neighborhoods to look at? Do you need a car versus public transit? What are the benefits that you have to start thinking about transitioning to? Do you need to find a new doctor, dentist, therapist, bank, childcare, house of worship, etc.? And is there a moving allowance that they allow you for? And is that reimbursement, or do they just give you a lump sum of money that you can spend afterwards? And how does taxes work on that? So you really want to be thinking about reaching out to current faculty at that place for advice. Some online resources for finding CL job beyond just this webinar. ACLP, if you just go to our website, clpsychiatry.org, has a lot of resources for finding a CL job. APA has a whole CL psychiatry homepage, as well as a council on CL psychiatry. That's one of the sponsors of this webinar. ACLP also has an early career psychiatrist, SIG, special interest group, and listserv that we often ask questions about this, about jobs, finding them, contract negotiations, etc. And Facebook, if you're still on it, CL Psychiatry Educational Network, or CLPEN, founded by one of our very own panelists, David Phipps, has been a great resource to talk more like in a communal manner about job-related issues. Again, as we mentioned before, ACLP has a career finder, APA is Job Central, and like your local APA district branch listservs and websites, often a great resource as well. Speaking of resources, the ACLP has a mentorship subcommittee, which is now offering career consultations for those of us in mid-career. So this will be a 30-minute video call. We can talk about anything from program development, research, education, career options, where they're accepting on a rolling basis throughout the year, and you'll get it within 2 months of receipt of application. So you can sign up at this link below. And again, this whole talk is going to be recorded, so you can always access this later. Speaking of later, in less than a month, ACLP is going to have its annual meeting, CL Psychiatry, in Miami, Florida. The meeting theme is promoting whole health for innovative and integrative approaches to CL psychiatry. And this is a really great opportunity to network, meet potential employers and employees. A lot of people even start interviews for a job at this conference and stuff. And there's several formal and informal events and opportunities to finding your first or next CL job. I'm just going to talk about it briefly in the next couple of slides. So on Thursday, there's a lunch roundtable, Pivoting in Practice and Navigating Career Transitions, which is a discussion for mid to late career psychiatrists who have made a career change or considering a career change. There's also a general session sponsored by the ACLP Mentorship Subcommittee for Mid-Career Psychiatrists. Professional growth is in one way, finding one's unique path to a meaningful and enduring career in CL psychiatry. On Friday, I really want to highlight the Ask Us Anything sessions sponsored by the ECP committee. These are roundtables with an open discussion forum with experts on these topics: career paths in CL psychiatry, contract negotiations, navigating challenging situations effectively, structure and leadership within ACLP, and using our unique identity for patient advocacy, which includes our very own panelist, Dr. Nick Forrester. So without further ado, let me introduce briefly in alphabetical order our amazing panel. I'm going to go straight into Q&A. So first, thank you so much, Dr. Jen Brockmeyer. She's at the Portland Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and she's a member of the ACLP DEI subcommittee. We have Dr. David Phipps from the Mayo Clinic Alex School of Medicine, and he's vice chair of the ACLP Mentorship Subcommittee. We have Dr. Cheryl Fleisch, who's part of both Included Health and University of Florida College of Medicine. And on a side note, she is the reason I'm in psychiatry, because she was a resident while I was a medical student at PIC and taught me all I know about psychopharmacology. So much love for Dr. Fleisch. Dr. Nick Forrester at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and a member of the DEI subcommittee. Dr. Arun Gopal, who's currently at Access Telecare and is going to be moving in January to the Los Angeles General Medical Center. Dr. Shruti Muthalik, who's at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and chair of the ACLP IMG caucus. And Dr. Mira Zain, who's at the Stanford University School of Medicine and San Mateo Medical Center, one of my oldest friends in CL psychiatry. So, oh, and there's me. I do stuff, yes. So now, let's move on to the meat of this panel, which is Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function in the chat. I will answer questions as they come in. I'll also start off with some pre-sent questions y'all send, and then kind of pepper them in as we go through. So I will stop sharing now. Thank you all for enduring my voice for the last 15 minutes. And welcome, panel. Thank you all so much for joining us on this Sunday to answer some questions from our attendees. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the question we start off with every year, because it's one of the biggest questions we get. Do you need to have done CL fellowship to do a CL job? Time for truth.
Since someone else is jumping in, I guess I'll.
No, you first, Jennifer.
I did CL fellowship, and I think it's been incredibly beneficial just for my own clinical knowledge. However, I will say I know people that I graduated residency with and attendings at my academic institution where I did residency who did not do CL fellowship. However, I think that's becoming less and less available in the academic setting, more so in community or VA or private institutions. If anybody else has experience with that, though, please jump in.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it depends on geography and density. So if you're looking to work in a metropolitan center, if you're looking to work in an academic center, then you'll absolutely need a CL fellowship. If you are going to be, going to a rural community, then most likely you won't need it. And if you're also in smaller community hospitals, so at San Mateo, we certainly have people that rotate on the CL service sometimes who aren't CL trained, but I would put a stick for the fellowship is super duper helpful, even if you don't end up doing CL for some parts of your job, because it gives you such a wonderful exposure to medically and psychiatrically complex patients that I would highly recommend it. But if you want to practice CL and you don't want to do the fellowship, there are places, but it might limit you in that geographic or kind of where you might end up from a type of hospital situation.
I'd agree. If we broke it down to a pure binary of can you get a job or yes or no, absolutely yes, you can get a job without the fellowship. The key piece is sometimes your selection of said job may have better availability of specificity and competitiveness if you have that in your background. For instance, if you wanted to just get a job somewhere, then yes, there's plenty of jobs in rural areas that certainly would allow you to. But if you had specificity, if I would like to work in this location at this place, or to have this sort of selective academic or clinical or research focus, it would make a lot of sense to have the CL fellowship behind you. One, because it shows that academic interest, it shows that pursuit, it gives the extra level of training as well as just exposure to CL. But also if put yourself in the shoes of a hiring individual, if you have two individuals who are both fairly equally competitive in the job for a CL director role versus an outpatient job that may cover the CL service every now and then, and the only difference between the two is that one has a CL fellowship, it would oftentimes make more sense for that individual to maybe favor the individual that shows more of a parallel CV towards a CL position rather than someone who has interest in it, doesn't have the parallel CV. I will also say I don't know anyone who has done the CL fellowship and said they regretted it. Though we can say many people who have not done the CL fellowship may have said it wasn't needed. Obviously, a little bit of selection bias with that statement. But I will say that I have not found someone yet who has done the fellowship who said didn't learn a thing, didn't help me at all clinically, or my abilities to get a job or get the job that you want as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Al. I want to ask actually a question specifically to Dr. Ungopal. So like in private sector world, like corporate community, like how do they look upon like having like CL fellowship?
Yeah, it's a little, I was thinking about the question asked. It's interesting. I think when you look at a lot of the telehealth companies, they don't really have the depth that somebody who's worked in CL or the academy or in kind of academia does. So they have a lot of roles that are kind of a hybrid of ER and CL, but they don't necessarily give you additional income or favor folks who are doing ED or CL. A lot of times they're just focused on, hey, we need to grow, we need to find a match to fit this particular role. So the advantages of that is you sometimes get to provide care to some of the most underserved areas, because with the reach of some of these telehealth companies, you're going into very rural markets where they don't really have CL standards. So you can bring a lot of good there, but the counterpoint is like many times it's just the average adult psychiatrist. You have no kind of specialty training that they're looking for, or subspecialty rather.
Awesome, thank you. So kind of going off of that question, this is for all the panelists. A big question we got, especially from a lot of trainees who all they know about CL is like inpatient consults in the hospital setting. Like, are there CL jobs that do like outpatient, a mix of inpatient, outpatient? Like, what does CL even look like in the real world, per se?
I think we were just talking right before we started that I don't think there's any such thing, or there very rarely that you can have pure one versus the other, but you can craft it into really what you would like, right? Whether it's fully telehealth, you can find those types of opportunities, whether you want to be in an academic setting if you want to do a mix of both. So for instance, I do some work in a psychiatric emergency room and CL service at a community hospital. And I also work at Stanford where I developed an integrated behavioral health program based on collaborative care. I was on the ICU and general services there before. So there are ways that you can mix and match, both in terms of places and the roles you like. Depending on how proactive you are or where you end up, you can certainly develop, right, the programs that you want to see, and things depending on what your passion is. So, right, I have colleagues like Dr. Sheila Lahijani who fully developed the psych-onc program at Stanford when it wasn't there before, and she does a mix of inpatient and outpatient. So I think there are lots of opportunities depending on where your passion is. And just because it's not there when you start, if it's something that you're interested in, you can always ask, hey, is there the potential for this? Or if you see a gap when you're working somewhere, you can push and see if you can start developing something if you're interested.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly sorry.
No,
go
you
ahead.
go, please.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that, so going off of that, I think that, yeah, one of the things that I often tell PGY2 residents that are rotating through CL is that what you're seeing here is sort of one very common form of CL, which is inpatient reactive model of consultation psychiatry, where, there's a consult question, teams need help with something. But even within inpatient the inpatient setting, there is the proactive model, there's the embedded model. There are embedded psychiatrists in some hospitals, in the ICU setting or the labor and delivery ward, etc. And then on the outpatient side, yes, there are psychiatrists who do either collaborative care or co-located care in cancer clinics or in perinatal health clinics, or I'm a transplant psychiatrist. So all my outpatient work is living donors, kidney and liver, and recipients, again, kidney and liver. And there is another psychiatrist in my institution who does heart and lung transplant. So actually, there's a lot of outpatient CL. And in fact, at some of the jobs that I interviewed at, they said that, well, cancer care is really moving to much more focus on outpatient health, outpatient care, both physical and mental health wise. And so most of your job will be, or like 85% of your time will be outpatient. So I would say arguably in New York, I think it's harder to find a job that's purely inpatient CL. You'll probably have a little bit of outpatient work. And of course, if you kind of have a vision, as has been said, there are always new things that come up. For instance, during COVID, there were people who wanted to work with, people with long COVID syndrome or neuropsychiatric sequelae of COVID. So, that was something that wasn't there before that got built in. Or at my previous job, I saw some patients with autoimmune encephalitis, and I wanted to continue following them even outside of the inpatient setting. And thankfully, I had the support to be able to do that on an outpatient basis. So yeah, there's lots of possibilities for outpatient work as well, if that's what you like. And certainly you can focus on finding something that's more inpatient focused if you prefer that setting.
Only thing I would add to that, I entirely agree with what everybody says so far. I think one other aspect is the administrative aspect, the educational aspect that are available that perhaps I didn't realize when I was applying. I think also, as Shandan has mentioned, there's also the community aspect. I think there's really a budding field of basically community consultative psychiatry. I spent the majority of my career working with folks experiencing homelessness, both in the hospital and on the streets. So I think it sounds really corny, but I think if you can dream it, really you can do it within the field of consultative work. And I think that that's something that's really creative and really exciting about our field.
And it really opens up the concept of what our definition of CL is. Even I know that our exposure to CL during training is often very sequestered into an inpatient concept. But if you look at CL kind of from the perspective of psychiatric care in the context of high medical comorbidity, or complex patients, or being able to liaise, the L of CL, being able to liaise to another specialty, whether it be embedded in the specialty, providing collaborative care to that specialty, or simply in a non-traditional setting to where it's more than just seeing a patient, treating their depression, and moving forward. It certainly opens many avenues to fulfill the CL concept. I would say the most common is in the context of heightened medical comorbidity, as was already mentioned, transplant, perinatal, oncology, so on and so forth, but also from unique perspectives of how we liaison to other specialties as well. Though that conceptually is true for many of the other subspecialties of psychiatry, it really is a core component of CL as a defined subspecialty.
Right, thanks all. We're gonna now move into like some pre-sum questions people sent about just the job process itself. So really interesting, a specific question we got. I'm gonna give this one to Monique first as a program director, and then open up for everybody else. So, Monique, is it worthwhile to reach out to CL fellowship directors at hospitals he ended up not matching at, but liked and would consider working for?
Absolutely. One of the things that I have done over the course of time that I've been running my program is I've sort of maintained an open line of communication with a lot of applicants, actually mentoring a few who didn't match with me, but are working in other places, because the field of CL psychiatry is so small, you have to maintain connections. And so, yes, if you didn't match at a program, could be for many reasons, totally fine. As a program director, I'm not kind of saying why, having hard feelings because somebody didn't match at my program or vice versa. So feel free to reach out. And sometimes your job sort of journey takes you back to that program, even if that wasn't the right program for you to train at. So just keep that in mind, and just make sure that you maintain communications, as Chandan talked about, sending those thank you notes, following up after the match is over. I've heard from applicants to say, hey, for many reasons I'm here, but I'd love to keep the connection going. Please reach out to me, or can I reach out to you? And I'm happy to hear from anybody. And again, keep those connections if job circumstances change and you want to be in a different place. Absolutely.
I usually talk about this process. I know we have a fairly wide variety of individuals in the audience, but if you are a resident or someone who is interested in pursuing a CL fellowship, I really view the CL fellowship application process as essentially a pre-job, right? Because unlike the rest of your career that has been, 4 years of residency, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of high school, you've been in 4-year blocks of education for the vast majority of your life. You're about to just do a 1-year thing. And so the amount of time in a CL fellowship isn't as long as what we're used to. And so when we're used to 4 years, we can kind of, develop interests, and, the people we met on the interview trail may not be as close of a connection as it was 4 years ago. But the interview trail is quite literally just a little over a year before you would be considering jobs. And though though the match forces you to have one place that you go for CL fellowship, Life Opportunities allows you to have many places that you could have a job. And so the relationships that are made, the connections that are there from the CL fellowship pathway is more than just where do I want to train, but also what relationships do I want to create and craft to then help throughout the rest of my career. And I love talking about, in my pathway of doing it, I picked one place to go, but ended up being able to make a lot of relationships along the way, and those have come to fruition many times in different collaborations for research, collaborations for ACLP, recommendations, even webinars, and things that just are good for building the career when it comes to a small knit community like this.
Yeah, and I would definitely say, speaking for myself as well as for most of the CL psychiatrists that I've talked to about this, I think whenever we hear that, a medical student, a resident, anyone is interested in CL, there's this excitement and the sense of joy and, oh, wow, we'll have one more person joining the CL community. So, certainly I think those connections and those relationships are really invaluable. And I think that as Chandan said in his initial presentation, within the ACLP, certainly the mentorship subcommittee or the mentorship program, that's been invaluable for me to meet some wonderful people and get perspective and advice and have those connections. And also, one thing I'll say is that there are all these special interest groups within the ACLP. So if you're even just like broadly curious about something, I would encourage you to join that, because I think it's really wonderful how these SIGs meet regularly, and then they'll be meeting at the meeting. So that might be a good time. I think most SIGs in November will be meeting in Miami. So yeah, just go to the meeting, and it'll be lovely to sort of build connections starting with that.
So audience is very timid this year. Y'all don't be shy, like just do and can, I promise you we're friendly. But I'm just kind of going systematically some of the pre-sent questions. Like the first place people often look for a CL faculty job is at their home institution. So like where they did residency, where they're doing fellowship. So I'm gonna first direct this to Dr. Jen Brockmeyer, and then I'll open up to the rest of the group. How do you go about navigating applying for a job at your home institution? What are some of the things people should be considering when they're thinking about that?
Sure, that's a great question. So I trained at OHSU in Portland, Oregon. And when I knew that I wanted to do CL, which was around the late part of my second year, early part of my third year, I started talking to people, pretty much all faculty, that was my plan. That was what I was going to do, because I wanted to have in their head that this was what my career path is going to be. As it got closer to my fourth year and during my CL application process, and then during fellowship, I kept those doors of communication open. One, because I actually wasn't sure 100% where I wanted to land after fellowship in terms of geographical location, or even, where I wanted to be longer term in terms of like what type of setting. But once I had that a little bit more clear during my fellowship, I'd already been in communication with faculty at my home institution. And I kind of had not necessarily an elevator speech, but a very clear, this is what I want. Are you hiring? Do you know of any opportunities? And kept that door of communication open. And so it became a very easy process for me to find a position, just because I had already been talking to people and kind of having my feet on the ground, knowing what was going to be available. And it just kind of went from there.
Any other thoughts on this panel before I move on to the first live question? Mira, go.
Yeah, I was thinking that sometimes you can feel like there's not enough spots, or that, right, the faculty is completely full. But I think asking the question is really important, and opening the communication, because even if there aren't spots open at your own institution, they might have connections where they can help you connect elsewhere, and be able to think about even like reaching out to people they know, helping you set up interviews. The other thing is, right, when I mentioned with one of the questions at the beginning, is you might be able to carve a niche out for something that doesn't exist at your institution. So if you're good, really, really good at women's reproductive mental health, for example, and that's not something that exists, so you can kind of talk to people at the institution, think about, hey, is there a chance that we could carve out a program, a place for me to develop this at the program? And oftentimes that can work. I would say in my instance, for example, integrated behavioral health didn't exist at Stanford, and then I was like, hey, let me try and develop this, and so found a way to get some funding for it temporarily, and then had it developed from there. So if you build it, it can come, or it will come. And so I think about, making that pathway for yourself, and never be afraid to ask the question.
I would
I'm
also
going to piggyback on that.
No, sure. I was just going to say I have a few favorite questions for interviews, and one of my favorite questions for interviews also matches fairly well with things that would be helpful to ask if you're interested in staying at your home institution that you trained at, even during your rotations. And conceptually, it's what brought you here and what kept you here. It can be a little bit more professionally and sneakily asked, but in essence, if everyone's reason for coming is no longer there, then what is keeping them there? Is it the good environment? Is it the leadership? Or is it, well, I got to pay off my house, and my kids are used to being here, and I really don't like working here, but I have it really opens up some of the communication to identify what was initially interesting to the individual, and if that interesting component that brought them to the job kept them there. And it's very easy and quick to find out if there's a fast turnover with that type of question. But it also, as a trainee, where you're not always privy to all the components behind the scenes of what it's like to work at an institution as an attending, it at least gives their personal story that could see if that meshes with yours. Like I said, I like it as an interview question in general, but it also has a little bit less of an interview feel when you're just working with an attending on a rotation. You say, oh, but what did bring you here back when you first came? Oh, that's great. Is that concept still there? Like, I came because it was a great chair of the department, really liked the direction they were going, but that person left 20 years ago. Why, why are you still here? What kept you here in that regard? It opens up some of those personalized statements that gives you an idea of, would you match with the concept of why they were there, and would you enjoy working there as an attending versus enjoying working there as a trainee?
I was going to add one more piece that kind of piggybacks along what a couple other people have mentioned, that if you know that you're going to be going into CL fellowship in your 4th year and that you think that you may want to come back to your home institution, start talking to people about that in your 4th year, because they may know a longer plan of if people are going to be retiring, if new positions are going to be opening, and so then they might already have you in mind for that particular position by the time that you finish fellowship.
So actually, before I move on to the live questions, and don't worry, participants, we will get to that. Really interesting question brought up, like, what happens if there is no program at your home institution? Like, what do you do from that in that situation? So I'm going to direct this first to Dr. Cheryl Fleisch, and then we'll have the rest of the panel weigh in.
Sure. So a while ago now, I guess like over 15 years ago, there was no program, believe it or not, at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is now one of the largest CL programs. But when I was there, there was no program. And so I knew I wanted to go into CL and had to make a decision what to do, either potentially stay at Pittsburgh but not do a CL fellowship, or had a sense of pressure that I needed to match somewhere else. And so I very much agree with, is it Mira? I'm sorry if I mispronounce that, Mira, that in my mind, I had to have a pitch basically for other institutions as to why they needed me, why they had to have me. Because in my mind, one of the things that you have to think about, especially nowadays, is that a lot of institutions do in fact match with their own folks. And I don't know what the other panelists feel about that, and they may have more information than me based on the new data, but there is about a 60% match rate. So the residents, you guys are going to have an advantage, and there's a much higher likelihood that you're going to match. Still, though, if you're coming from an outside institution and you have the pressure to match elsewhere, there is a more of a likelihood that other individuals will match internally. So in my mind, I had to have some sort of shtick. I had to have that elevator speech that Jennifer was talking about as to why the other programs needed to have me. So at the time, I interviewed at several programs and thought to myself, basically, these are my, top 5. Am I going to, I took it just like residency. I took it, as a very serious process. I think David Phipps actually had a similar, actually, I know he did, because he was one of the people that rejected our program when I was program director. And I meant to say this earlier because David and I have had a fantastic relationship all of these years. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I contacted him to ask him for his assistance in a situation that happened at his program in Mayo. And I think I entirely agree with what the other, with what Dr. Forrester said about keeping in touch with people who have basically, quote, rejected your program. I've maintained contact with almost everybody who has not come to our program, and we've maintained really good relationships over the years. And I absolutely did not take it personally. It's actually been like kind of a joke that we've maintained friendships over all of these years. So I guess I know that was a bit meandering, but I think all of those things are really critical.
Oh, thank you all for answering this question. So I'm gonna go at least from like a process perspective to one of the Q&A. Is there any recommendations on timeline when applying broadly? Like, do you recommend starting reaching out to multiple places at the same time? Is it all spaced out? You just swipe right on every position that comes up that you like? Like, how does it work? Because right, like there's no firm timeline written out for this process.
I would say you have to kind of know what it is that you want to do. I have had fellows who have come into fellowship and have had their first job already lined up in that first month of fellowship, depending on what they wanted to do. I think in general, what I tell my fellows is that around this time is when you should be sending out CVs, contacting institutions to find out what's available, going to ACLP to network and figure out who's there. That is how I got the job that I'm in, that I've been in for the past 12 years, is going up to the program, the division director of CL at ACLP and being like, hey, I'm from Maryland. I'd like to come back to Maryland. Can we figure out a way to interview? So now is around the time to really start that process. I don't think it has to be done in the summer, but I've experienced that. So I want to make sure people know that. But also, and then thinking as you're in the first few months of fellowship, if you're doing a CL fellowship, what do I like about fellowship? What are the things I can see myself doing in career? Because you kind of do want to have that elevator speech of what your interests are, because an institution or a potential employer is looking to see if you all match in terms of what they have available or what they're trying to build. So you do need to have a sense. I do find that when people are a little bit too general, it might not have as much impact as when you're saying, here are my interests, here's where I see my career going. Even if it's not fully fleshed out all the way, you want to have something.
I can speak to just from a particular like VA perspective of, depending on the organization, it can take a really long time to go through the hiring process. I started talking to my current employer, the Portland VA, about this time last year, and I just started 2 weeks ago. And that was not because I wanted to start in October, but it quite literally took that long for all of the paperwork to go through, etc. So it can be a very long process depending on the institution that you're at or that you're wanting to work at.
I would add that conceptually, you know, we've had to have a very specific deadline and start date of if you're just now coming out of residency or out of fellowship for all our career, right? You know, classes clearly start at this time, residency academic year clearly starts at this time, and if you don't have your next step done by this time, you know, crisis, right? Right. But that's not necessarily the case for getting a job. Other than the understandable financial strain of not having an income if you have a major delay after you're done with your last stage of your training to starting a job, that obviously is a downside, but there's not necessarily a penalty for not having a job immediately right away. The other piece is that your first job is likely not going to be your permanent job. If it is, great, awesome, but it very well may not be your permanent job, and it doesn't have to be your permanent job. And so if there is a timeline that makes you more comfortable or less comfortable, kind of weighing your pros and cons with that, with the wellness knowledge that you don't necessarily have to have your forever job exactly July 1st at the end of your last step of training. There's plenty of ebb and flow when it comes to time start date of job, but also end date of job as well. So if you feel like, oh, I don't think how do I know if I picked the right job? Well, if you did, it would be very clear. If you didn't, then you can clearly find another one. There's very few jobs where we can say this, but being a psychiatrist, and in this context, a subspecialist psychiatrist, there will be jobs available in that regard. And so timeline, important if you want a seamless transition, but the necessity, like the rest of your, the previous years of your life, of having an exact perfect transition isn't as detrimental to your career as it would have been if you didn't have a residency to go to after medical school, for instance.
Yeah, I think that, no, I think that what David said is actually probably a perfect segue into what I was going to say, because I think that on the one hand, absolutely, I think that, one of the pieces of advice that I've found most invaluable is that psychiatrists are extremely, valuable people, and don't let any, administrators or anyone ever tell you otherwise. So don't undervalue yourself and your skills and expertise. But I will say that, in terms of sort of the penalty of not applying on time, as an international medical graduate, and I'm sure there are people on this call that are international medical graduates, and certainly for us, I mean, the penalty would be kind of like not being able to stay in the country because of the visa status. So yeah, I think that given the fact that one of the key questions, sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need the program to be able to sponsor you for, or the job to be able to sponsor you for a visa to be able to stay in the country. And that can take time. And there's some unpredictability sometimes with that. And then sometimes it doesn't come through, and then you have to kind of scramble, etc. So I would say that as an international medical graduate, who needs visa sponsorship, I would say start as early as you possibly can. And again, there are some layers to this. Rules keep changing. But if you're on a J1 visa, for instance, there is the Conrad 30 visa waiver program, which is kind of the state-sponsored J1 visas. And the rules are different for different states. So I would say one of the first orders of business should really be to get a legal consultation. There are lawyers, like now it's been 10 years, but it was like $100 fee for a lawyer, but I thought it was really, really invaluable because they kind of give you the lay of the land. So definitely kind of invest in a legal consultation to get information about what the Conrad 30 situation is for different states, et cetera, what you need in place. For instance, Connecticut, as an example, is sort of, there is a certain deadline and it's first come, first serve. So, literally people like line up on that day to get their application in. Whereas New York, it's just a completely different process. So it's a lottery system. So it doesn't really matter how early you get it in, so long as you get it in before a certain date, and then they sort of pick names out of a hat. So just know that. But also, I think that, while I was going through the process, there were times when I was a little bit demoralized, but I think that, sometimes things happen that you can never imagine or plan for. So for instance, in my situation, I was on a J1 visa. And, for those of you who are not familiar with the J1 visa, basically you could extend it 1 year at a time for a maximum of 7 years. And I actually maxed out the 7 years, partly because I'm passionate about education, but also I kind of, wanted to stay in New York. And I was prepared to do this waiver. So you either have to go back to your home country for 2 years after you exhaust those 7 years, or you have to do 3 years of a waiver in an underserved area. And, I was interviewing and nothing was really sort of exciting me at the time. But then I was very, very fortunate that when I was doing my actually geriatric psychiatry fellowship at Northwell, a military recruiter came and spoke to us. And he basically talked about this program called MAVNI, which is Military Accession Vital to National Interests, which is basically a pathway to citizenship. Like you basically get commissioned as an officer, you get US citizenship in exchange for military service. And of course, there was like an adventurous part of me. And so I took that opportunity. Again, it was a very, very long multi-step process. So I think, again, the timing almost took like 8 or 9 months to get everything done. But, I was very fortunate that it worked out, and it was just an amazing adventure. I met wonderful people. And even there, actually, I would say the CL fellowship training helped, because I did speak to sort of the specialty leader in the Army, saying that, I love transplant, I love CL, I love education, I want to be able to do that. And, fortunately, I did get to be in at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, which is an academic center, which is a tertiary care center where there's a med school and residents and fellows. So I was able to keep up the education and also work with the living donor and transplant program. So I feel like, as a philosophical kind of meta point, I feel like there were points in this journey where I really felt like, oh, this visa thing's not going to work out. I'm not going to be able to do CL, I'm not going to be able to be in an academic center. I'm not going to be able to like fulfill these passions. But you know, this thing just came out of nowhere. So just keep your eyes and ears open. And I think that a lot of people that I know have been able to do things in CL despite visa restrictions that were beyond their imagination. One of my colleagues right now at Mount Sinai actually is on something called an O visa, which actually, you know, those of you who are on visa statuses should look into. It's not something that's utilized that often. It's like this exceptional skill or exceptional ability visa. And actually, subspecialty services can often render you eligible for that. So for instance, she's doing transplant. And so she got a lot of support from the department saying that, you know, transplant, absolutely, our program needs a transplant psychiatrist, and she's that person, etc. So just something to keep in mind, you know, just knowledge is power in this regard. So, you know, speak to people, speak to lawyers, and keep your eyes and ears open.
I would just add one more thing in terms of timeline, which I think you touched upon, Shruti, at the very beginning, is the idea of looking at the timeline and as soon as possible. So I'm thinking specifically in the context, if you're looking at APA listings, ACLP listings, even if you're on LinkedIn, it'll tell you when something was posted. And so you do want to try and reply to that as soon as possible. And I'd actually encourage people to go and see if you can find that listing on the actual website, whatever company or academic program it is, and reach out directly through there if you can, so you're not going through that third-party recruiter if possible. But I would also say is, even if something, let's say, has been posted for 65 days, that I would still send a message, because that's something that you're reaching out for. And you can always ask, is like, hey, if that position's been filled, then is there something else possibly? And if it's a recruiter, they might be able to connect you with other opportunities. If it's the actual institution, then that's an opportunity, you know, for thinking about creating those relationships, checking back in down the line if there's something else available, if that's not the case at this moment. I think the last thing, if you're looking at those websites, especially if it's a federal position like a VA position, or if you're looking at like a state or community hospital, they will have like very specific close dates that they are accepting by. So making sure you get in by those close dates, because they stop looking at applications after that entirely.
Sorry, one other thing. If the person who asked the question, if you were asking about additionally application just to the fellowship program, and should you apply all of the programs at the same time, my answer would probably be yeah, apply for all of the programs at the same time. There's no real reason to like space them all out. The only reason to apply for a program at a later time, I actually did this, was if you applied for a bunch of programs at the same time, went to the interview, and then you were hesitant that perhaps they weren't the right programs for you. There is a long period of application time from like July 1 to I think November 1. Somebody might have to correct me. So if you did do interviews and perhaps you realized that the initial interviews were not right for you, then there is enough time for you to apply to additional programs.
Yeah, thank you. So actually kind of now transition go over to Val. Yay, now you got job offers. First of all, congrats, you got job offers. It's a great rush. But question, do you have recommendations for leveraging offers or trying to optimize the timing of getting offers so you have more than one to look at once? I've heard that once you get something in writing, time starts ticking before you have to give them the response. And I think this is a great question, right? Because when we're applying for like medical school, you got an undergrad, you got all your acceptances, if you like to get more than one, and then you had a set deadline, you had to reply to everybody. For residency and fellowship, it's just a match. Like you only get to make one rank list and then everybody finds out at the same time. So this is like this weird, like it's kind of, the rules aren't really out there. So what do y'all think about this? Like, how do you optimize the timing when you maybe have more than one offer?
So I will say that my general advice around this is to kind of know where you want to be. Negotiation should be used as a tool, but not as a way to leverage yourself over a potential employer that you're trying to form a relationship with. So try to negotiate for things that are meaningful to you, but not just to simply see if you can get it kind of thing. And then also like using multiple offers usually is to try to leverage salary. So you want to think about like what what is the salary range that you're looking for? You should be talking to people about what the general salaries are in the area. There's ways to even get information around what the salaries are for academic institutions. So you should kind of know what that is so that you're not falling outside of the range, especially in academia where the salaries are probably fairly set. Versus a community setting where you could potentially make more. So you kind of have to understand where you want to go, what the rules are around that. And I would sort of generally discourage people from trying to leverage multiple offers to increase salary. I actually turned down a job that was paying me more than the job that I took because I realized that that job was not for me in terms of the other responsibilities that I would have to undertake. So you have to kind of know what's important to you and where you really want to be, and then use negotiation to amplify some of the things that would make it better for you, like whether that's benefits, sometimes it is salary, but again, be realistic in your salary requests. Or is it like vacation time? Do you need to make sure you have CME? Those types of things. So I would encourage people to really think about what they're negotiating for.
I think that's an excellent answer. And the only extra thing that I would add to that is because of this audience being probably near their first or one of their first CL jobs considerations, sometimes it takes getting a job and seeing what those components are to know what you want. And so don't necessarily feel like you have to have everything completely figured out, but have an idea of what those components would be so that when you see a model of time off, CME, location, work-life interactions, the research opportunities, educational opportunities, your clinical focus, have an idea of what those are sometimes, but sometimes it takes doing a job, seeing what you're like, well, I definitely liked that versus, oh, I definitely did not like that. And it is okay to have something that is not 100% perfect to your liking to be at better shape your next role of being able to say, this is what I would be interested in my next job.
I 100% agree with what they said, particularly know what is negotiable. It is such a turnoff to negotiate something that is non-negotiable. I've had people attempt this with me, and I say to them, like, literally, the salary, you can't like make more than this because you just can't. And it push and push and push, and then it becomes a turnoff for me. And then I no longer want you at our place. And I think that's something that people don't realize. They continue to feel like they are the one with the upper hand, and that turns away. So the other time is to consider when to negotiate. The time to negotiate is when you have that offer letter in hand. Don't negotiate too early, and you can't negotiate too late. Your best time for negotiation is during that window period when you have the offer letter, and the offer letter can be changed. Now you can request an extension. So if they say to you, you have 14 days to respond to this. Again, as Anik said, don't use that as like unnecessary leverage. But if you really do need like a few weeks to respond, you can ask. I have done that before. I've been like, hey, I need like 3 weeks. And then they'll give you 3 weeks, especially if they really want you. The other thing is, there are a lot of things that are negotiable. I have negotiated every single contract I've ever had, or every single offer letter. I've also done things where they decline to actually put it in the offer, and I've had to decide if it was worth it for me. But we've had it basically what's called good faith, and we've had emails back and forth. And it would have been such a turnoff for me if they did not abide by that I would no longer have remained at the institution. So there are a lot of different ways to negotiate, including things that appear to be non-negotiable. But again, don't over negotiate, because that is also a major turnoff.
Yeah, no, definitely. Oh, sorry. I
Oh,
just gonna
sorry.
say, I definitely agree with what Dr. Fleisch said and what everyone has, so eloquently put. And I think that was beautifully put, like, don't over negotiate. So I think that, as everyone was speaking, one thing that came to mind was that it's kind of like a spectrum, right? Like there's passive, there's assertive, and there's aggressive. So you definitely don't want to obviously be obnoxious and, keep pushing when somebody has said that that's not an option. But at the same time, there are certain things that you might be depriving yourself of if you don't ask. So for instance, if you are relocating, I think it's perfectly appropriate to ask about, whether they cover relocation expenses, which can be really a handful. Asking maybe in a general way, does your institution offer sign-on bonuses? I mean, I think that that's kind of like a general non-threatening way of asking. Or if you have a clinic kind of position, asking about, is there admin time? So I think that, definitely make sure that you ask for things that are important, that would make your life easier. But yes, definitely, make sure to follow effective and informational cues from the people that are interviewing you.
I wanted to ask Maroon specifically, like, advise people in doing about contract negotiation again, focusing more on like academic jobs, like in like private corporate world, like are the rules any different for like contract negotiations? What can be negotiated? What cannot be?
Yeah, I think in industry it's interesting because you do have a little leeway when it comes to things such as salary, probably more so than in some academic settings. But to echo everyone's point, like coming in with an unrealistic ask can sometimes be a massive turnoff. Like you're not even in the ballpark of what folks want. Typically, though, we do have the salaries listed, so there's a little bit of wiggle room around that, so you know what the target is. I think the parts around negotiating to kind of echo Anik is that you really do need to be careful and know with these RVU models in productivity settings, like what does that actually look like when you're working? And is that something that you can sustainably manage day to day? So that's something to be very conscious of when you're coming in, maybe even putting guardrails around what you think would be reasonable for productivity. Because I think in the industry side, the goal is to get people working as much as fast as possible, just to hit those margins. But I don't know how sustainable it is for a lot of folks. So that's something just to be really cautious of, and to maybe even talk to other people in the company that you're applying to.
So going off that, one of the questions that came in is contracts in the academic institutions, but we can also say non-academic, are said to be non-negotiable by HR, but many contract lawyers actually say it's possible. So we've been talking a bit about it. Like, can you all speak to this and what aspects of a contract actually negotiable in y'all's experience?
I can speak from the VA perspective that the VA salary is largely not negotiable. The things that I was able to negotiate were the amount of relocation, the relocation amount that I was able to receive, as well as academic or administrative time that I was able to get throughout the week.
I'd say bonuses, some wiggle room on salary, and then for us, you could also choose to or not choose to supervise or collaborate with NPs, which gives another set of revenue, basically looking at their notes, supervising them. But it's buyer beware in the sense it also opens risk, because you have to really trust that the NP is doing the right thing and be able to do some quality control, because you become linked from kind of a medical legal perspective with that NP if you're collaborating with them.
I would say it's
And I'm hearing, sorry, go ahead.
You go.
I was going to say, a trend I'm hearing from a lot of y'all, especially in academic job, is the like amount of money that you're getting may not be negotiable, but you can negotiate the things you have to do to get that money. So whether it's like how much time you're spending on service versus in clinic versus administrative time, which clinic you want to be in versus which one you don't want to be in, stuff like that. So it's kind of a paradigm shift because you often focus on just like set number as the end all be all, but there's a lot of things that go into that, especially in academic jobs, is what I'm hearing from y'all.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I wrote down a list just now when you guys were talking about like what things that I thought were negotiable. You guys mentioned a lot of them. Some of them sound really silly, but I realize that they're really important for quality of life and then also affect your way to then subsequently get reimbursement. I wrote down CME, and by that, I think we mean a lot of different things. That includes financial ways to get to conferences and then to actually obtain our CME, because you literally have to pay to do CME. But I also mean paying for the whole shebang, going to different conferences. I mean, the institution supporting you to go to multiple conferences during the year. That can be upwards of $5,000 or more during the year. So that actually adds up to quite a bit of money. And so if you get that, that can offset a lower salary. Literally getting an office. One of my institutions, I literally negotiated an office because we did not have, I would not have had an office otherwise. Office furniture, that sounds silly as well, but you might go into an empty office. So trying to figure out how to actually obtain furniture, your relocation fees, which people already mentioned, admin time is huge, because if you're doing 10% admin time versus working during that time, that changes your ability to get reimbursement. Again, the hours that you work, the salary, as everybody has said, sometimes can be a little bit of a tough direct negotiation. I think perhaps has a slightly more leeway as you become more senior, but still that is a tough direct negotiation. And then I also wrote down here licensure reimbursement. I think a lot of people do not realize that you can get, you can negotiate for licensure reimbursement. You have to get your DEA, I believe, like every 3 years, you have to get your regular medical license. Some of us have multiple licensures, and so it can become very costly. And that's another thing that you can ask for, among probably a variety of other things that I didn't mention.
So like I wish again, like I'd had like these specific pointers like when I was applying for jobs, because it was like the Wild West when I was applying. Like I don't know what I'm doing, I'm gonna make it up as I go along. But again, as David mentioned earlier, like your first job isn't going to be your forever job a lot of the time. So everything's a learning experience. Question actually to go back, Mira, to something you mentioned earlier about like the program we created. So what did you have to do to find or ask for funding to create your own niche programs within CL? Was it funding within this institution or outside of it? So I'm going to give it to you first and then open up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, in my instance, it was funding within the institution. And so it was really kind of making the case. So I had to like build what Dr. Maldonado calls a business plan, where I could like kind of basically prove that this would, be profitable or be able to provide, sufficient positive patient care. So you want to be able to make your case for why the thing that you're building, has, the potential to help, and it depends on where the funding is. So you want to get to know at the institution, like, what are the different types of funding? So for instance, Stanford has what is called Tier 2 funding, which comes from the actual hospital, so it's not from the department. And so you also want to find out, are there other programs that, that provide money to Stanford in other ways that you can potentially get grants from, that you could do a pilot, for instance. So I applied for that Tier 2 funding. And so there was a whole application process, and I had to kind of demonstrate like what was the utility, and then it was approved for like the first year, and then kind of had to make the case again moving forward for that. And so, knowing at your institution what the processes are, where there might be different income streams, you're going to need to ask around. And if there are people at your program who have already kind of tread that path and developed their own programs, asking how they did it and asking about them, like, what is the funding they created? That can also be part of your job negotiation. So for instance, with my San Mateo position, when I negotiated with them, I had originally negotiated a certain set of FTE aside to help develop a refugee and asylum evaluation process for the county. And so that was something that they agreed to as part of like that total FTE. And that might change depending on, how things move forward, but that is something that you can think about, and building into the initial part of your job.
I did the identical thing. So I negotiated 20% time right when I started out of my fellowship. And essentially that was based on the good faith, essentially. They had faith in me. My chair was essentially putting me almost in a research bucket, even though it wasn't research, it was a clinical program. And he was going to literally just pay for 20% time, more or less, because he believed in me, because I had proven that I was able to develop a program in my fellowship and in my residency. And so he paid for the 20% time. I showed that it was valuable. And then I was kind of semi on my own, not exactly, but he continued to actually fund the 20%. And then over the course of many years, I was able to get funding through the hospital system. And ultimately, towards the end of my time at my institution, I was basically 80% for the program that I had developed, and then 20% with the department as program director for the CL fellowship. And then in my current role at University of Florida, I currently do telehealth with something called Included Health, but I'm 10% with University of Florida right now. And that's actually through an external grant. So it's different than what I did at University of Florida. And this is for a clinical program, but we're funded through an external grant. So that's another way to do funding.
Yeah, I think that both what Dr. Fleisch and Dr. Zine have shared is so pragmatic and so sort of practical. And I personally have mostly not been a very practical person. And so actually during my residency and fellowship, I had no idea, or nobody had kind of talked to me, I think, or maybe I missed it, what an FTE is. And this was something that I learned as an attending. And I think it is actually something that is helpful to know in training. It's basically like one full-time equivalent. So basically, if you have, like a classic like full-time job, like Monday through Friday entirely, that is sort of one FTE. And your time can be bought out. So for instance, in my current job, I mean, I've always been one FTE, but the job distribution has changed because basically the buckets of money have changed in terms of who kind of has bought out my time. So at one point it was fully transplant, but now, it's 0.25 FTE from the med school. So that's kind of paying for that time. And that, because I have that educational time bought out, I don't kind of have to cover the service at that time. So I think that this is important to know, because different pots of money can pay for different parts of your time, and that can change as you sort of take on more administrative responsibilities, or let's say you become like fellowship program director, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just an important concept, I think.
I think it also helps conceptually, just if you're in your interview or if you're talking with the decision maker of the department, such as the chair, saying, where are your needs? What departments are saying, we really wish we had more psychiatry involvement? What needs is your department not fulfilling? Are there educational concerns that are there? Are there research concerns? But more likely, where are your clinical needs, right? And so using transplant as an example, if the transplant center was saying, we want more psychiatry involvement, and you guys just aren't giving us psychiatry involvement. And so the chair is able to say, well, actually, yeah, that is something that could have more value. Then that already gives a conceptual opening and a discussion of, well, how could we negotiate that we are giving value to the transplant center by having the payment for our time being there? Because there's always some area of the hospital system that likely is talking about how they wish they had more mental health input, right? We're always a need, and we're always something that could be optimized. And from the viewpoint of CL that really is engaged in liaisoning, embedding, and integrating and collaborating, if there's an area of need, then that would open a little bit of an avenue of being able to say, well, not only could we help the psychiatry department, but we could also be helping this external department that could open the discussions for funding of your salary that may be shared or may be available to then create a program around, if that is your goal from that perspective.
Another thing I wanted to mention that I think is often not talked about when the whole like negotiating salary, et cetera, is the opportunity for moonlighting. A lot of institutions have non-compete clauses. And so if you're wanting to earn money outside of the institution, you may not be able to do that. I know that at the VA, at least, they do not have a moonlighting non-compete clause. So I'm able to work outside of that. And if I wanted to build my own private practice or wanted to work for, a CL job part-time, I could do that. So there's just something else to think about in terms of like money stream.
Thank you. A bit of a specific question. Speaking of FTEs, who keep saying this term, like I had no idea what that meant until maybe like the end of residency, maybe fellowship, but like, can one of y'all explain the difference between FTE and CFTE, and how does this matter for job negotiations? So David, I'm going to direct it to you because you're in my field of vision.
Sure. So FTE stands for full-time equivalent. And the way that an institution uses FTE may be a little bit different because we sometimes use it as an overarching term, and sometimes they use it as a colloquialism. In essence, if you're working 5 days a week, you have 10 half days, right? And so what are you doing on those half days, and what income service is paying for your salary during those times? And so we keep using like points. You've heard people say, 50%, 20%, I have 0.25 FTE, so on and so forth. Essentially, if you have 10 half days and someone pays a certain percentage, how many of those half days is your salary being paid by this external source? So for instance, if I work 4 full days for the CL service, and then I work a full day at the medical school, then we would be able to mathematically determine who is paying my full-time equivalent of a salary, and where does the salary income come from? Does the medical school pay part of my salary? Does the transplant center pay part of my salary? Does the psychiatry department pay part of that salary? Does the piece that I'm involved in? So essentially it's where you're working, And if you think of this from an MBA standpoint of someone who is not a clinical physician, someone who is simply saying, what are the numbers? This individual has this much of a salary, and where are we getting the income production to allow this salary to occur? And then mathematically, where does this come from? That is at least conceptually where a lot of this comes from, especially from the academic realm. There may be other methods of approach in the private realm, but at least when we discuss that from purely a mathematical perspective, this is an MBA term of you have this many days that you are working. How do we mathematically determine who is paying your salary for that many days? Sometimes it's very simple. You're just 100% working at a certain place. Other times, especially if you're involved with academic work or in integrated work, you may have other places paying part of your salary. For instance, I also work in transplant, and the transplant center provides payment to the psychiatry department to allow for my work to be engaged with the transplant center. But there also is components to where I work in the psychiatry department as well. And so different avenues of where your time is spent and how the money to justify your time is incorporated. That's my basic explanation of an FTE.
And I think for CFTE it's like clinical FTE, which is like how much time are you spending in clinical activity versus, let's say, a leadership position or administrative, and so each institution might have a different definition of what clinical FTE might be, and some institutions might not differentiate between FTE and CFTE. So it's really going to vary. It's good to ask the question of like, hey, do you guys look at CFTEs and calculation of that? So that's kind of that difference if CFTE versus just general FTE.
I think one of the things I wish I had known was that, let me try to figure out how to say this. There are certain things like, say, my 20% time that I had to do my niche clinic, that was actually like protected per se. I really had that 20% time because it was on a single day. But then there are other times where you have certain things that you supposedly have in 20% time. And it's very easy for a lot of stuff to be squished into that 20% time, specifically educational stuff or administrative stuff. And that happens oftentimes when you have half days or when supposedly you have 25% of an FTE, because 25% does not go across a day very well. It's like a day and 2 hours. And so what happens a lot of times, and I did not understand this when I was going out of fellowship, is that if you're doing, say, an assistant program director position and you're supposedly 10% time for that, Dr. Forrester can give me a tremendous amount of stuff to do that week or whatever. And maybe I'm doing 50% time that week, but I still have my other duties to do. And if Dr. Forrester gives me just a lot of stuff to do every week, but I'm supposedly 10% time, then maybe I'm actually doing like 30% time really every week in that position, but I'm only being paid for 10% time. So it's really important before you accept positions to really ask a lot of questions about like, so Dr. Forrester, what are my duties for this position? What days do you expect me to work at this position? Those are questions that I absolutely did not ask, that I didn't know to ask. And I really thought I was going to only be working like 5 hours because I was given 10% time. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that, if they can explain that any better than I did.
Well, so that's very interesting, Dr. Felsh, because actually the next question we're going to ask is, what are some things you wish you knew and asked back when you're interviewing, negotiating your first CL job, and can you provide context? So thank you for answering that question ahead of time, but what about for the rest of y'all? No regrets, just knew everything already? Like,
Yeah, I think Dr. Fleisch actually said exactly and more beautifully exactly what I was going to say, that I think that as a multi-passionate person, you can get very drawn to, oh, I'll be able to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that. But as David explained, so it's basically like 5 half days, 1 FTE. And so if in theory you have, one morning doing oncology, that afternoon doing, HIV clinic, then the next morning doing transplant. Like, it might excite you, but at this, in theory and as a concept, but in practicality, I think that could be an extremely stressful job because, first of all, are they all at different locations? Secondly, half days are really hard because, there's collateral calling, there's patient crises, there's admin work, and there could be a lot of loose ends that you don't get to tie up in one block that spill over into the next block. So there's something to keep in mind.
I would say, like, for me, I have clinical FTE as well as administrative FTE in terms of administering a fellowship and then also doing administrative work in my department. So I think it's important for people to understand, like, as you're progressing in your career, like, you need to sort of understand how to balance yourself, but also really realize things do spill over and you have to be realistic in terms of the amount of time that you need to do something. And sometimes it's important to go back and say, I need more time, or can we talk about this? And when the question is about like things that we wish we knew, for me, I felt like I had a very clear sense of direction in my career, and my career has not gone the way I thought it was going to go because I was able to be open to different possibilities. And so you have to sort of like know what you're interested in, but then realize, like, as you start to do the different jobs, maybe transplant isn't the thing for you. Maybe you loved it as a fellow. It was great, felt good. 5 years in, you're tired and you want to pivot. Maybe you thought you did not want to do inpatient CL because maybe you felt burned out in your training and you were like, I don't like inpatient CL, it's too acute. I only want to do outpatient. And then you realize, no, I like a hybrid. It's important to say that you can change your mind and to keep your options open and not feel like you're pigeonholed into one thing. So those are the things I would say, like, I wish I had known that because I really dealt with a lot of guilt in terms of changing my mind about things that I thought I was going to be doing.
I would say conceptually something that's very helpful to have in mind, and we can say this to a trainee, you can say this to someone who's actively working, is being able to separate out what you find enjoyable and fulfilling and your why from a clinical perspective versus the environment that you're in. Because many people will say, oh, I clearly want to do this. And it's not because they enjoy doing the work of it, it's because they enjoyed the environment that they were in. Or the flip side, I thought I loved this because I absolutely loved doing it in residency and fellowship, but man, as soon as I came here and started doing this, I hated it. So I must absolutely hate conceptually seeing these types of patients or seeing this focus of patients when actually it's the environment that you're in. And so being able to utilize a DBT concept of, pulling yourself out of the situation, saying, okay, big picture, what is it that I actually liked? Right? What was it that I had a great multidisciplinary team with excellent leadership and mentorship, with awesome nurses and interactions with the social workers, and that happened to be in my HIV clinic, versus I love the specifics of HIV. I love talking about the minute specifics of the pharmacologic interactions. But man, I'm telling you, this environment that I'm in is very stressful. I must not like HIV. Being able to separate out that concept of, do we actually enjoy the clinical context of actually what we are doing in the patient population versus are we finding the emotional strain or benefit from a well-mentored and helpful environment. Being able to identify that separation makes a very big deal when it comes to us identifying why we want to do something and our okayness with changing to something else that we may similarly enjoy. I find many people, even down to the medical school level or even residency level, they say, I want to go into this specialty. Why? Because I had an awesome attending when I was a medical student. But did you actually enjoy doing it? Or vice versa. I really loved doing this, but man, my whole time on this rotation was ridiculous because I had someone who was stressed all the time. Being able to separate out the interpersonal interactions and structure of a service that may make it more stressful doesn't always mean that we don't like the clinical context of something.
No, thank you all so much. We have just a couple minutes left. Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to leave our attendees with in terms of things I'd wish they'd known or advice as they're going forward into the jobs?
I think one thing to think about in terms of things that I wish I'd known is looking at people who stay and also the transition out to different jobs, because I think it'd be really hard when you, especially when you're in your very first job, to feel comfortable like saying, I'm going to leave and I'm going, you know, and so if you're looking for a job and you want to stay at that job forever, then make sure that you're asking lots of questions for lots of people. But otherwise, I would say that know, you know, kind of what you want to do in the first couple of years, and then have a longer trajectory of what you want to do, you know, moving forward, let's say 5-10 years, and know, is this the right place for you? And if it's not the right place for you, what can it do to help you start building those building blocks for your ultimate goal? And your goals might change as you go forward, but making sure that you're choosing things, like thinking about ACT therapy, like that are in line with your values, is going to make it easier to, you know, to do things as you go in terms of meeting those goals. And so is the place that you're, you know, that you are applying to going to help you build your CV in a way that is helpful for your goals at the time? Is it just to, you know, make money? Like, no, it's so that you can get enough funding so that you can move to a place that you want to. So having in mind the whys of why you're applying, asking questions around, you know, is this really going to fit the goals that I'm looking for? And then when it comes down to it, it's okay to then move on to the next job if this job is no longer meeting the goals that you are having. I know that I had a lot of guilt around, you know, leaving work for other people when I thought about transitioning roles, and know that these jobs will always have applicants that will be there to fill those positions. So it is okay to take care of yourself and your well-being. And so I think people forget about that in the process of finding jobs, no matter, you know, where they are.
Yeah, just one last thought is there's a difference between a job and a career. It's kind of the difference between a chapter and the entire book. You know, so the book can have many small chapters or, you know, a couple of long chapters, but really the bigger story, you know, so don't go too much by any one of those chapters. It's the bigger story. And, you know, best of luck to all of you in your careers, and I'm sure they'll be wonderful. And CL is a great field.
So we're just a little bit over time. I'm just going to share our last slide, which has our thank yous. So special thank you again to the ACLP Mentorship Subcommittee, the ACLP DEI Subcommittee, the ACLP Business Psychiatry Subcommittee, the APA Council on CL Psychiatry, Faye from ACLP, Brooke Trainham and Dustin Gershenson from APA staff, and special thank you all to our amazing panel for volunteering their time on a Sunday afternoon to answer all these great questions. If you're still on, you have any further questions, feel free to email me at chandlan.kanda@gmail.com. And this event is part of the ongoing ACLP mentorship workshop series. So look for more exciting things like this moving forward. Thanks, y'all. Have a happy Sunday. Thanks so much again, panel. Really appreciate y'all.